Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we want to delve into a hypothetical scenario in which we would see a conflict between the Russian Federation and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, look, we are already watching this take place. There is a real-time conflict right now occurring between Russia and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with its proxy forces fighting in the Ukraine. Now, what if the conflict expanded? What if, hypothetically, the conflict expanded in the direction of the Baltic states? Now, I have received a couple of questions about the enclave of Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad located here. It's situated between Lithuania, a NATO member state, Poland, a NATO member state, and is separated by this Polish corridor here, the Suwalki Gap, and in this area, obviously, is Belarus. Now, the question is, could NATO, could the North Atlantic Treaty Organization seize control of Kaliningrad? Could NATO do that? Well, the short answer is it would not be NATO. It would be the full support of the United States. The United States would obviously have to intervene and utilize its significant advantage in air power to engage Russian forces. Now, early in this conflict, if we were to see this conflict start to take place, there are many that believe that the Russians would storm the Suwalki Gap and create a corridor from Belarus to Kaliningrad. Now, I don't believe that would actually take place. I believe that NATO capability would prevent the Russians from taking the Suwalki Gap. You have a very large military force in Poland. You have other NATO member states such as the United Kingdom, and more importantly, the United States, that would contribute large amounts of forces that would prevent the Russians from storming the Suwalki Gap. Furthermore, the U.S. air capability would make it very difficult for the Russians to continue to supply its forces inside of Kaliningrad. And then we would probably see some sort of ground operation involving Polish forces, forces of the United Kingdom, forces from the United States, directly entering and attacking Kaliningrad. Now, it would be a very bloody conflict. It would be very tough for NATO to enter Kaliningrad and then eventually storm the city of Kaliningrad itself. Very built-up area with lots of large urban areas, large Soviet and pre-Soviet buildings exist in this area. A lot of industrial centers as well. On the outskirts, you have forests. You have open plains. It would be a difficult operation for the United States and NATO to take the enclave, but they could do it. They could do it. There would probably be a siege, and there would be intense urban fighting taking place in Kaliningrad. Now, the problem would be the Russian response. If we go back to World War II, in a matter of weeks, upon crossing into the Soviet Union, the Germans had taken large swaths of what was the Soviet Union, including Minsk, Kiev, and very quickly found themselves on the outskirts of Moscow. Now, obviously, we would not see the same sort of operation in a Russian NATO conflict where we'd see NATO rapidly moving into the Russian Federation, rapidly moving into Belarus. So that would not happen. That would not occur. But they would have the capability to threaten and possibly take control of the Kaliningrad enclave in this area. Now, the Russian response. What would undoubtedly happen would be a complete and total mobilization of the Russian military. We have not yet seen that, even in this Ukrainian conflict. That has not yet occurred. But if there was total and complete mobilization of Russian society, I mean, obviously we are now in a state of the Third World War. This is what we are talking about now. Now, what you would see on the Russian part would be a counterattack or a counteroffensive into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It would be very difficult for the United States and its Western European allies to mount a defense of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then eventually you would see a Russian counterattack into Kaliningrad. You would probably see limited Russian operations against Poland into Polish territory. You would see a counterattack by Russian troops on the Suwalki Gap itself, a ultimate seizure of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and then a move and a horrendous ground fight would then occur between the Russians and NATO in this counteroffensive by the Russians to attempt to retake Kaliningrad. Be a very brutal fight. Now, at the same time, yes, you would see this high-tempo operation of NATO air capability against Russian forces, but at the same time, you would see Russian air defense systems and the Russian Air Force taking a toll on NATO capability as well. NATO would lose aircraft. They would probably lose lots of aircraft to Russian S-400s and other systems in this conflict. Now, additionally, while this was occurring, you would essentially see the collapse of the European economy. You would see heating oil be cut off, heating gas be cut off to Western Europe. You would see massive amounts of Russian Iskander missile strikes, cruise missile strikes, drone strikes against targets such as located in Warsaw, Germany, Denmark, Holland, even possible the targeting of Paris and France and London with these Russian ballistic missile systems as well. It would become a horrific conflict, but yes, early on it would be reasonable to assume that NATO would have the capability to take Kaliningrad. But the question is, would it keep Kaliningrad? And the short answer to that is through attrition and the general mobilization of the Russian army, the loss of the Baltic states. Ultimately, it would be very, very difficult for NATO to remain control of Kaliningrad. Ultimately, you would probably see here in the United States conscription go into effect. The selective service would become real with an actual draft taking place. The war would be incredibly unpopular here in the United States as casualties would mount. And you have to understand that, indeed, casualties would absolutely mount in such a conflict, and then ultimately would probably at some point involve the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and in all probability the use of nuclear weapons would then expand depending on what was happening within the conflict, within the confines of the conflict. But ultimately, again, a very bloody conflict that would last for quite some time, and God only knows, we can only hope that does not occur. Again, this would be have the prospects of a civilization-ending conflict if it were to occur. Right now, things are relatively contained between NATO's proxy forces, the Ukrainians, and Russian forces. But again, it is highly likely that at some point this war, this conflict that is taking place right now in the Ukraine, as NATO tries to expand into the Russian sphere of influence, the traditional Russian sphere of influence, that this war could ignite and grow intensity in the scope, meaning outside of the Ukraine. But we'll continue to monitor the situation and watch what is happening, and obviously bring you more information as events warrant. But again, as always, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.